All right. Dr. Sledge, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's really, really a pleasure to see you this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to have conversations about these somewhat strange topics, especially at 11 in the morning. It's really nice to, usually these are had in the dark of night, but it's nice to have them when the sun is up.
I just want to say that for me, your channel, Esoterica, really represents like the best of what YouTube has to offer. And I really mean that from my heart in terms of the level of scholarship and erudition and your presentation and the density of content in your videos. I feel like I've learned so much from you, even though, of course, this is the first time I'm ever actually getting a chance to speak to you. So really thank you for that.
That's very kind. Thank you. Yeah, I totally, I'm really feel a lot of gratitude and a lot of grace around the ability to get this information out there, to talk about these otherwise obscure topics that I don't get to teach at the university. And so the fact that there is an audience out there and then I can present them, and hopefully I'm presenting them in a scholarly, reliable, accessible, but also fun way, right? Like, this is weird stuff. We should just own that it's super weird. And if you can't have fun with it, then what are we really doing, right? So I'm really thankful that that folks like you are finding the content rewarding and engaging. So I appreciate your watching.
And I just want to give one more shout out and thank you to actually, the reason I found your channel was because of a commenter on one of my videos. And so I just wanted to say that person knows who he or she is. And thank you because yeah, it's great to sort of have that little community that I've created and have someone sort of point me in the direction of your channel and recommend that I try to reach out to you. So that was great. So thank you to that person. Okay, your channel, of course, is called Esoterica. You sort of introduce your videos by saying this is where we talk about the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. I think I may or may not have gotten that right. And I've been trying to grapple with what exactly that means. Like, what counts as esoterica? Like, what exactly does arcane mean in this context? Because it seems to me like part of what makes your channel so unique is that there's like this emphasis on the weird, like the exotic. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a focus on things that have basically been either knowledge that's been rejected as such. It's knowledge that's been rejected either by the Enlightenment or by science or by philosophy or history or whatever. It's been knowledge that's been rejected. So, for instance, alchemy, right? We've now developed the science of chemistry, and the idea is that alchemy basically is either redundant or nonsense or both. Well, I think it's more complicated than that. That's not to say that alchemy holds some ancient secrets that we need to unlock or something like that, but that if you don't understand where these ideas came from, well, that's always a problem. We should always kind of know how we got to here. And so what the channel does is it explores topics that have either been rejected or that have been suppressed, actively suppressed. And of course, topics like Kabbalah, topics like magic, those are actively suppressed by pretty powerful institutions. And the suppression of that knowledge has led it underground, has pushed it underground. And I think people are interested in those topics. And the problem, at least the problem that I discovered when I began to look at some of those topics online, is that a lot of the information about those topics is pretty uneven. A lot of it's pretty bad. And so the task of the channel is to use all of modern academic scholarship, right? I'm an academic, I'm a scholar, I work in a university, to take those tools and to present this otherwise unusual, hidden, suppressed, rejected forms of knowledge, to present that in a way that people can get a handle on it, can get access to it, can people who are interested in it, either for historical reasons, right, or for practitioner reasons. Even if you're a Kabbalist or a person practicing ritual magic, it gives you access to this material without it being filtered through, let's call them spurious channels. It says, look, this is an academic analysis of the material.
Interesting. So why would someone be interested? So obviously you mentioned a few possibilities. Someone could be a practitioner of the topic, and that would be a good reason to study. But let's say someone who's an outsider. What's the value in learning about alchemy or demonology or Kabbalah or all these things?
Yeah, I think it's the same reason why someone might want to learn about Norse mythology, or someone might want to learn about Roman textile production. It's part of our history. Now, it's a pretty obscure part of our history, but if you think about it, almost every aspect of our history is pretty obscure. And so if I were to have a channel about ancient Roman engineering, which I imagine there could be a channel about that, well, that's a pretty obscure topic, but history says, yeah, Roman engineering was a big part of how world history developed. Well, magic was a big part of how religion developed, right? Alchemy was a big part of how modern chemistry and science developed. Kabbalah is a huge component of how Jewish theology developed and still very popular to this day, both in popular culture and in the more Orthodox world. It's also actually really interested in people who are not in the Orthodox world, including non-Jews. So on the simple way of putting it, this is parts of history that just don't get taught. And any reliable historian, any reliable philosopher, any reliable scholar of history has an obligation, an intellectual obligation to teach history in its fullness. And in my opinion, these topics are the topics that get left out. Mm-hmm. So do they radically transform our understanding of ourselves or radically transform things about how we might do things in the modern period? I'm not so sure about that. But I think that when we intentionally leave gaps in our understanding of history, we're doing ourselves an intellectual disservice. And my tiny little addition to the whole story of what we do here in Western civilization, whatever that is to add those voices back in and say they were decisively important. And I'll give one example from history, the witch trials. Between 1450 and 1650, 60,000 women were basically executed on a conspiracy theory, right? The idea that there were a bunch of women making pacts with the devil to undermine Christianity. That was a conspiracy theory that was basically cooked up over the course of a couple hundred years. Tens of thousands of women lost their lives who were innocent, right? Subject to torture and then killed because of the belief in this conspiracy theory. Well, one of the really important things we know about history is that famously, right, if we don't study it, we're doomed to repeat it. And are conspiracy theories still around? Of course they are. And they still operate, right? Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, QAnon, they're still around. And so by studying something, for instance, like witchcraft, the witch trials, studying the works of inquisitors, right? Studying the works of magicians, we begin to get an understanding of how this stuff worked historically. And I think, all right, and I strongly suspect, in fact, that will give us better tools to understand now. Mm-hmm. And that's the best thing, it's the most we can ask from history.
Right. So obviously you cover, first of all, you're very prolific, which is amazing. And you cover such a wide range of topics. And some of them, like we've talked about, for example, Kabbalah is practiced today by many people, and some of them seem to be really lost to history to a large extent. What comes to mind, of course, your most recent, or one of your most recent videos in the Mayan rituals of bloodletting and things like that. And so one of the things that I find really interesting and fascinating about the way you present these topics is you come at it with tremendous amount of respect, I would say. And I was wondering if you can explain that. Like, what does that mean to approach these topics, which are, to your probably average audience member, so incredibly foreign, and come at it with the kind of respect that you do?
I think that the typical attitude that I try to have, and when I approach any topic on the channel, is what I call critical sympathy or sympathetic criticism. The criticism part is pretty easy to sort out. I'm not going to just say I believe in magic, or we should all practice alchemy, or you should be a Kabbalist. I'm going to say, no, there are serious historical problems with a lot of these ideas. And, scientific or otherwise, we can criticize them, and we should criticize them, and we should admit that there are gaps in our knowledge, or that these texts contradict themselves, or whatever. So I'm critical of the texts. I think the problem often is that in the way we've studied these texts historically is that we've been overly critical to the point of basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think that's a historical intellectual mistake. So when I approach these topics, I try to be deeply sympathetic to them. And when I say sympathetic, I try to understand them on their own terms. So when the Maya engage in bloodletting, if you ritual bloodletting, if you look at that from the outside, that just looks bad. It looks scary. It looks like, for Christians and Jews and Muslims, like paganism. We associate the kind of stuff with maybe devil worship or so. We have all kinds of preconceived notions about that. We have all kinds of negative images of things like self-harm and etc. Well, if we come at it from that angle, we're going to misunderstand what those people were doing and why. And so when I come at them, I try to come at them to understand their practices and beliefs using the terms that they provide, using the worldview they had. And I try to situate them in their worldview and make sense of them on their own terms, rather than trying to put Western scientific Enlightenment ideas on them and then judging them all the while that I'm describing what they're doing. Because if I'm doing that work of judging them, I'm going to inherently misunderstand them. Now, I'm probably going to misunderstand them no matter what I do. But I find that if we try to understand these these practices, these ideas from the inside, they make a lot of sense, right? Now, they may not make a lot of sense to us, but from the inside, from their own world, they do make a lot of sense. And by presenting them that way, I think that it allows people to get a handle on what these people were doing so that it's not just sort of, we should do what they do. I think that that's probably wrong. And I wouldn't present the material like that. I'm not there to convert anyone to Mayan bloodletting or alchemy or something, Kabbalah. And further, I think that if we just approach them from the point of view of criticizing them, what ends up happening is we end up unconsciously making fun of people. And I don't think that's actually elucidating to the material at hand. I think we misunderstand them profoundly, misread them profoundly, and that's a disservice to intellectual history, to historical development, to any kind of way of understanding people. So the sympathy comes along. The sympathy is part of trying to let them speak on their own terms, and everybody in history deserves that right.
Yeah, and maybe there's a sense there that there's like a universal humanity at play, and that even though we're far removed from that, cultural context, in a way, the scary thing or the important thing to recognize that they're humans like us, and if we were born into that context, that would be us. Sure. And so I think is very appreciated, that perspective.
Yeah, I think that people now like to believe they would be different. But I always ask my students, how many of you belong to a religion different than your parents? And most of them raise their hand. They belong to the religion of their parents. Like, would you let your parents pick your partner, your job, your major? Would you let your parents pick your clothes? Of course you wouldn't. But most of us just kind of go along with the flow. Well, we shouldn't look back to ancient peoples or medieval peoples or the ancient Maya and go, why would those people believe those stupid things? I'm like, probably for the same reason you believe the stupid things you do, because they're people and we're all brought up in certain kinds of circumstances. And so we should be sympathetic for why people believe what they believe, not throwing rocks back into history to mock them.
Sure. And also we live in such an intellectually diverse society where for, only the recent history has there been sort of the opportunity to pick and choose, I think, to some extent.
It's far easier now than it ever has been. And still most people don't.
For sure. Okay. So this sort of, I guess I see as an invitation to sort of personalize the discussion towards me a little bit. Because I grew up in a Orthodox Jewish household. And not only that, I grew up in a household, and most of my teachers taught me a kind of rationalistic Judaism. So Kabbalah was seen as sort of a late appendage that was unnecessary or inessential. So I guess here's a question that I've been wondering, and I think about when I watch your videos, for example, your excellent, amazing history of Kabbalah series, which you're putting out now. If I were to ask a question like the esoteric content of the Zohar is like sort of an absurd question, because in a sense, I think the whole book sort of is esoteric or is dealing with with this kind of mystical content that you're interested in teaching. But what about the Talmud? Where does the Talmud fall? What if I were to ask, what's like the esoteric content of the Talmud? What would you say to that?
It's a great question. So the Talmud's not, again, I'm sure we both spent time in Cheder, so we both know this, right? The Talmud's not one thing. The Talmud's a conversation that ran over the course of several hundred years. And like any conversation, they meander. And like any conversation with a lot of people, they're always going to be weirdos, right? You always have Shimon Bar Yochai in the room. You're going to have Hanina ben Dosa in the room. Choni's been, the circle maker in the room. You're going to have some guys that are up to some weird stuff, because every community has some guys up to some weird stuff. And in the Talmud, especially in the Babylonian Talmud, this is less true of the Yerushalmi, but in the Babylonian Talmud, there is a lot of strange things in there that aren't just halacha, right? That aren't just Jewish law stuff, right? What happens if a bull falls into a pit, right? And they go on and on and on about that. Well, there are all kinds of things about, should you do things in pairs because that attracts demons? And that's right there in Pesachim, right? And so there's a long digression about, should should we drink 4 glasses of wine at Pesach? Because 4 is an even number and pairs of things attract demons. So what do? You drink a glass and you look at the roof of the beams of the house, and then you drink another glass, but because you looked at the roof of the house, it interrupted the transition from the first to the second, so it's not a pair. So they won't attract demons. I don't know about you, that sounds pretty weird and esoteric to me, but it's right there in the Gemara. In fact, I tend to tell people when I study Gemara with people who want to learn some of the stranger things in the Talmud, is that typically what ends up happening is the stranger things in the Talmud tend to be at the end of the Masechta, right? They tend to be toward the later part. So if you look at Sanhedrin, right, all the sections of Sanhedrin are about death penalty cases until you get to
Perchelik, chapter 11.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, chapter 11 around Dapim 95, and then they get into the weird stuff, about sorcery or about Mashiach, right? And so the thing about Talmud is, there's all kinds of exoteric things in the Gemara, no doubt, right? Baba Batra, it's like, but then buried right into Baba Batra, right in the middle of the discussion of torts, some of those boring stuff is the oven of Achnai, perhaps one of the strangest tales in the entire Gemara. And so I think that there's an esoteric dimension of the Gemara. And if you study, I've studied in a bit in yeshiva, what I find is, especially for younger Bukhrim, they're happy to pass over those sections, right? Because they really care about, right.
That was me.
You're right, they'll pass over it, right? Because really what they care about is kashrut, they care about Shabbos, right? They care about nidah, right? Gittin. They're happy to throw you into tractate Gittin, right? Because obviously divorce is an important thing. When you get to the later parts of Sanhedrin, they're like, let's move over to talk about, Berachos, right? But even in Berachot, the early sections of Berachos, all those sections there about demons inside of bathrooms, and they're, all that stuff. So I think that and again, the modern Orthodox world, I think, is especially, the modern Orthodox world lives, and I don't know if this is your experience. In my experience, they live under the shadow of the Rambam. Right, the Rambam casts the longest shadow. Maimonides, casts the longest shadow, and there's this interpretation of Maimonides, right? That's very rationalistic and very Haskalah and very sort of brisker style Gemara study, and that long shadow hides some of these stranger aspects of the Gemara, which are there in plain sight. It's not like they're, it's not like you pick up a copy of the Vilna Shas and they're not there. They're there. They just don't get emphasized. They don't get studied. You're not going to learn them at Kollel, unless with a little whiskey at 11 o'clock at night or for bringing or something. Right. So I think that's part of it, right? It's the shadow cast by Maimonides, especially in the modern Orthodox world.
So I would love to just look at one specific example, and you mentioned this, and when you went through, I think you did in your list of examples, and I have it actually open in front of me on Sefaria.org. It's right in the beginning of Brachot. I'll just read in English. It was taught. Abba Binyamin says, if the eye was given permission to see, no creature would be able to withstand the abundance and ubiquity of demons.
Yeah, the Mazakin.
Exactly right. And Abaye said they are more numerous than we are, and they stand over us like mounds of earth surrounding a pit.
And then reach your arms out, you hit them.
Right. And Rav Huna says each and every one of us has 1,000 demons to the left and 10,000 to the right. And then it goes on to give like a recipe, like a bizarre, mystical or I guess a magical kind of recipe for seeing demons. And I think one of the rabbis tried it out and he injured himself. I think that's the end of it. Right. So here's a way that I read this. Okay. And I'm curious to hear what your reaction is. The translation, the word nazikin literally means injurious things, damaging things.
Damagers. Yeah.
And there's a sense in which in a pre-scientific age, I think there's something very astute. The idea that we're surrounded by invisible microbes, for example, things that we can't see, but if you could see would be sort of horrifying to you, that are damaging, that pre-modern people might have had some sort of intuition about this idea that like of germ theory without having any words or tools for even, expressing what that might mean. Is that a possible generous interpretation of what's sort of going on here?
Sure. I mean, and also I think that the fact that in the early section of Berachot, where they're talking about the Mazakin, right, those sections are also talking about demons that are associated with bathrooms, which obviously bathrooms in the ancient world aren't terribly sanitary places. Sure. I think that whatever the Mazakin were, right, is probably overdetermined. Some rabbis probably associated them with something like disease, and we see lots of examples of that in the Gemara. There's a recipe for a certain demon that you count on your fingers to get rid of, and it causes it to explode in the Gemara. So one way of reading it is a more rationalistic way of reading it. It's a proto-germ theory way of reading it. And that's a very rational way of reading it. And I think it's not totally off the mark. I think the other way of reading it is they believe that the world was actually filled with supernatural entities. And those supernatural entities were dangerous. And we not only see them associated, the Mazikeen associated with bathrooms, but also ruins, right? And they tend to haunt abandoned places and things like that. It's an idea in Christianity too. The medieval Christians thought that the Colosseum was haunted and didn't go anywhere near it. If there were a haunted place, that'd be it. A place where people ceremoniously killed each other for sport. So I guess for me, I can wear two hats here, right? On my academic hat, what I would want to say is they're talking about supernatural malevolent entities because that's what they tell us, and we should just go along with what they tell us. Now, of course, I don't have to accept the existence of those entities. But if I were in Chavrusa, if I were studying with someone and I needed to make sense of it in a modern day context, I would probably go your route, right? Say maybe it's a kind of proto-germ theory. But I think that when you weigh the predominance of evidence from the Gemara, right, there was a range of opinions. Some people thought, look, basically, I don't know, astrology, for instance, is Narishkeit, right? And then there were other people who thought, no, absolutely, it's true, right? That the amount of kids and the wealth that you have are dependent upon it. So I think there's just a range of opinions. And I think that if you were a particularly superstitious person, you could find lots of superstitious things in the Talmud to back up your superstitions. If you were not particularly superstitious person, you could find them otherwise. I love in that story about the demons and the four thing in Tractate Pesachim, they go through this long discussion about how to avoid the problem of the demons. And then at the very end of it, they say, oh, those in the West don't care about this. That in Palestine, they don't care about this. It's a uniquely Babylonian superstition. So I always like the fact that someone in the back said, hey, I'm from I'm from Galilee. We don't care about this. What are you guys talking about?
Right.
So again, for me, it's as an academic scholar, when I'm presenting in public, I want to say this is what folks in the 5th century believed in Babylonia. And there was a range of opinions. I always joke, right, that anytime that it's almost always non-Jews who come to me and say, the Talmud says, I'm like, yep, probably an anti-Semite.
Right.
Almost always, because anyone who's ever studied it knows that it doesn't say any one thing.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and that's true for other religions as well. When you hear someone quoting a religious text like that, and that's obviously a very important point. Okay, in your introduction to Kabbalah video, one of them, you recommend, or I forget exactly the content. I think you were helping people, maybe a different video, but being able to access the Zohar. That was the context you were talking about. You recommended that people look at the story of Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai. Can you share what that story is? And why you think that's such a, I guess, characteristic or important story in this kind of literature? Yeah,
I think that it's interesting because, so the story, right, is that there is this oven that's been divided, right? And the question is whether it's kosher, right? Because if you prepare meat and milk inside it with a divider, right, whether or not that is that oven is kosher, whether it's one oven, basically. And they go back and forth about this, and eventually what ends up happening is Rabbi Eliezer is able to summon basically miracles to prove that he's right, and he's rebuked by another rabbi, probably Yohanan, I think. I don't remember, but maybe, yeah, sounds right to me, I think it's Rabbi Yohanan says, eventually he's rebuked and says, look, it's not in heaven, right? And he quotes Devari and says, it's not in the heavens can't decide this. And then the Bat Kol comes, the voice from heaven, and says, what happened in that day, and Banai. Right. Yeah. Right. My children, whatever that means. We're victorious or something. Yeah, we're victorious, right? And Hashem was laughing. Right. Right. That it was a joyous event. And I think what's interesting about that story is that it shows that the writers of the Gemara have a playful attitude to divinity. That it's now, of course, that story goes really bad for Rabbi Eliezer at the end, right? No one ever talks about that last part where the bad stuff happens. But I think that what's interesting about that story is that there's an interesting relationship between the miraculous, the mystical, the rational. There's a relationship there between what's mystical and what's argumentative, right? What holds to be arguments and what doesn't. Even who gets to be an authority, right? Because not even God gets to be an authority in that moment. And I find that the story, it so disrupts so many of the ideas that many of us have inherited from religion, where we have sort of God on a throne telling everyone what to do, and if you don't do it, you'll get annihilated, which I think Christians, Muslims, Jews have all inherited to some degree. And the story of an Achnai is really interesting because it disrupts that narrative and says, oh yeah, there's a lot of play here. There's a lot going on here. And it's in that playfulness that you begin to see how esotericism begins to work. Because the Zohar and other texts that are inherently esoteric, Sefer Bahir or whatever, they're playful, right? They're reveling in weird contradictions and in weird plays on words and in very literal readings, for instance, of the Torah. And so what I find is interesting about that story is that it disrupts the way people think about authority, logic, mysticism, miracles, magic. And it shows that the boundary between those things is really topsy-turvy. And for me, what's important about that text is it's right in the Talmud. It's not like it's hidden in some weird book that's heterodox, off the derech. It's like right in the Gemara. And if there's any place where you can sort of, at least in the Jewish world, put a finger and say, we have to take this seriously, right? Where else in the Babylonian Talmud, you know?
Right. And is there an element there of the rabbi saying we are liberated from a kind of literalism or a kind of veracity, a kind of a truth seeking of God's will, that might constrain us. We're in a sense liberated from tradition to some extent, liberated from what we think, maybe historical Judaism might have been, because, it's not up to God, it's up to us.
Yeah. Or it's at least up to the way that at least God has to play by the rules that God put down. Right. God can't put down rules and say it's not in the heaven, then be like, hey, you guys have to do this. You're like, no, you can't play. You got to play by the rules, man. I'm a Reconstructionist Jew, right? I subscribe to Reconstructionism. I would say I'm a pretty strong follower of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan of blessed memory. And his famous saying about that, right, is that Reconstructionism is the idea that the tradition must have a vote, but it can't have a veto, right? That science, modernity, those things have to lead the way. So they lead the way, but tradition has to have a vote. Now, on the one hand, that sounds like you're free to do whatever the hell you want because the tradition only gets a vote. But what I always remind my fellow Reconstructionists, right, is that in order to give tradition that vote, you have to do the heavy lifting to go back to the Chazal, to go back to the tradition, to go back to the Rambam, to go back to the codes, to go back to the Shulchan Aruch. And if you're going to violate this stuff, if you're going to break these rules, if you're going to innovate, you need to, if you're going to do that, in order to give the tradition a vote, you have to do the heavy lifting of giving them that vote. And you have to give them the best vote they can, right? And it's actually a heavy lift because it means that we have to deal with all the difficult things about modernity. And it means we have to bring tradition with us and we have to make them talk to each other. And of course, modern Orthodox Judaism does something very similar, much more bound to the halakha, I think, than Reconstructionism is. But I find that for me, in my personal religious practice, having to juggle those two things, tradition and modernity, right, makes for me a very, what's the right word? Rewarding religiosity.
Yeah, that's very nice. There's another story in the Talmud, which I always think about in conjunction with Tanur Shel Achnai. I think it's in Menachot. It's a story where Moses goes up to the mountain and he has a vision. He finds himself in the lecture hall of Rabbi Akiva, I think.
Yeah.
Right. So this amazing anachronistic hallucination.
Right. And he has no idea what's going on.
And that's the brilliance, right? He has no idea what's happening in this lecture. Right. And Moses is crying. And then he feels better because Rabbi Akiva at some point says, someone asked Rabbi Akiva maybe like, where is this from? And Rabbi Akiva answers, I got it. It's passed down from Moses at Sinai. And there's like this time circularity happening, like this vision of the future, which is hearkening back. And also
there's no early and late in the Torah, right? So I love that story too. I think that's one of the classic, that we must rely on the wisdom of our ancestors and we must be daring enough to transcend it. And striking that balance. No one's going to do it right? But you have to do it. I mean, again, it's Pirkei Avot, right? That you can't abstain from the task, but you have to, Rabbi Tarfon, right? You can't abstain from it, but you got to do it. You got to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So another question, a side effect, maybe a psychological side effect of growing up in what seems to be a rationalistic milieu. So first of all, I think one of the things your channel does is it shows that there's a lot of my education that might have been ignored or left out. There's a lot of roots to sort of mystical ideas that, maybe were not emphasized in my education, which I'm now learning about. So, but beyond that, there's this like psychological, implication maybe that certain things are irrational. Like I'm rational, and that's irrational. And so I guess like is mysticism irrational? Would be my question.
I think that some mysticisms are irrational. So let's make a distinction, right? So let's call rational whatever is basically describable by propositional logic. So let's just call that. That's not a great definition, but it's a pretty rough and ready one. It'll do, I guess. Non-irrational things are things that break the laws of logic, right? They're P and not P, right? That you accept P and not P. And that's a disaster, logically speaking. Right? So those are irrational things, illogical things. I think that a better category, I think that rather than thinking about those two things being the only two categories, I think that there's a middle category that I would call the non-rational. And the non-rational are categories that employ logic as far as they can until they can't. And when they can't, there's just experience left over. And there's just the naked phenomenology of experience. Now, I know that sounds like a crazy idea, right? Because we typically in the modern world think there's rational things and there are irrational things, and I'm rational, I don't do irrational things, except for the common experience of art, right? Everyone enjoys art. I bet you've listened to music today. I have. I've paid money to go into big buildings with paint smeared on things, and I've gone into giant symphony halls to listen to basically random sounds that sound wonderful and bring me to tears. Art is, I think, an example of the non-rational. We can apply rationality to it. Music, for instance, is highly mathematical, but you're never going to mathematize the feeling of, the Ninth Symphony bringing you tears. You're never going to mathematize the feeling of seeing a Matisse for the first time, or seeing the supple changes in the marble of a Michelangelo. And so it says, yeah, we're going to bring logic and rationality as far as they can, and then admit that they can't go any further, right? And the experience is always like that. Tell me describe to me the mathematical and logical nature of being in love with someone, or, seeing a child laugh or whatever. I have 2 little kids, and I sure as hell can't do it. Won't even try. So I think that part of what's important about the mystical is that it is that most mystics, they live in the non-rational. They don't live in the irrational. For instance, the Zohar. The Zohar has very clear parameters in which it operates, right? It follows rules, right? The laws of induction that you see, for instance, that are used in the Gemara, etc. Christian mystics have rules they have to play by. There are logical operators they're using, and they come up to a point where they say, and beyond this, I can't talk about it. It's an experience, it's beyond all language, blah, blah, blah. Much very similar to art, I think, in this way. So on the one hand, mysticism sounds very foreign for many rational modern people. But then I tell them, you do it all the time. It's the feeling you get when music moves you past rationality to something else, like emotion or transcendence, or it's when a piece of art does this to you. It's when a movie like elicits out of you some primal feelings of rage or anxiety or, I don't know, beauty. And so the mystics dedicate their lives to systematizing that experience and then looking at the consequences that flow from it and how to make it happen again. So in my experience, I find the mystics to be very rational until they're not. Mm-hmm. But we often just look at what's not and then judge everything else by what's not and then write them off. I think that's a titanic mistake.
Okay. To finish up here, just a few quicker questions just to end with. A question that I fret about a lot when I read religious texts. Does morality change over time?
It must, at some level. It must. I mean, morality is a very difficult topic just because, at least from the philosophical side, it's difficult to tease out what moral theory is right. There are 5 or 6 competing moral theories at this point, at least in the philosophy of ethics. I think it must. I think in one example, I think that where it's very clearly changed very recently and for the better is, and not completely yet, is our treatment of non-human animals. For most of human history, we treated non-human animals as basically machines that we could do whatever we wanted to we could basically torture them for fun or sport. Many cultures engaged in all kinds of dreadful things, and we still do engage in dreadful things about how we treat non-human animals, women, people outside of our tribes. And there's been a shift in the past couple hundred years where we do think about, oh yeah, you just can't use an animal for sport. That's beyond the pale, right? It's beyond the, you can't fight dogs just because that's enjoyable to you. And I think that there's been a sea change in that. Now, it's not total, it's not complete, right? And there have been echoes of it in the past, but I think that morality does change. And also think that the future will look back on us and think, wow, they still like murdered animals by the billions to like make shoes out of them.
So it changes in practice, but does that sort of absolve the past? Does that absolve us? I mean,
I don't think so.
I'm maybe I'm appealing to like a metaphysical morality, like an ultimate, you know what I'm saying?
Ultimate, kind of ultimate morality.
Maybe it doesn't exist.
Right? So whether it's the Torah or the categorical imperative of Kant, it could be either one, right? Those are both transcendent theories of ethics. But even on a utilitarian calculus, right? The sort of classical utilitarian calculus, it could just be that just in the same way you get better at doing math, you could just get better at doing the calculus and include more things into the calculus, right? It could be the case that because of developments in neuroscience, we now know that animals experience pain, and therefore you now have to take their pain into account, whereas previously, you know, in the Middle Ages, maybe they just didn't know that for whatever reason. So it seems to me that it depends on which system you choose to pick to live by, the categorical imperative of Kant, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, natural law ethics, the Torah, right? And even the Torah, what version of halakha do you pick up or whatever? So it seems to me that it has to develop over time, and it does seem like it gets better. I mean, even the way we do war now, right? We commit war, we still do war, and there's still atrocities, but we're not engaged in like total war, you know, where we put our people in the harem and just like burn down everything. We think, no, that's egregious. It's too much. So there must be some moral development over time. That seems relatively clear. I think the same Scandinavians that were once Vikings who enjoyed, you know, raping and pillaging are now one of the most peaceful people on the face of the earth. They got better.
All right. Well, another quick metaphysical question. Is the world that we live in mostly good or mostly bad?
You mean this planet or the universe in general?
I don't know. The universe in general. Creation. The creation of our universe.
I'll quote the Gemara, right? The Gemara makes it really clear that the rabbis took a vote and asked, would it have been better had the creation never have happened? Whether human beings should have never been made. And in fact, the angels petitioned Hashem not to make us. And eventually Hashem decided to do it. The angels lost, and the rabbis came later, right? And you probably know the story. They voted about whether it was worth it, and they unanimously, or not unanimously, the vote came out and said, no, it was not worth it. Like we're more bad than good. But the result of that, right, is that yeah, we're more bad than good, but because we're here, we have to be righteous. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of a metaphysical pessimist. Like I look at reality and think, yeah, I don't know if this is all that great. Maybe it's actually really bad, but insofar as I'm here, I do feel like I have a moral obligation and intellectual obligation to leave it better than I found it, knowing that, you know, in whatever 10 to the 40 years from now, the last protons will decay and there won't be anything left anyway. But that doesn't really, it doesn't bother me for whatever reason.
All right, last question. Sure. How, if at all, does Judaism inform your politics?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, it's a pretty cliche answer, right? There's this, you know, we have this tikkun olam business, right? Then, of course, in the Zohar, tikkun olam has nothing to do with helping poor people. It has everything to do with putting up the felon to make sure that you realign the Sephirot to usher in the days of Messiah. So I would say that the messianic idea in Judaism, I think, is a really, really important idea for me. And because I'm a Reconstructionist, I don't really believe that there's going to be some person coming into history to fix this for us. And even in the Gemara, I think it says that the Messiah will only come on 2 occasions, that the world prepares a world worthy of Messiah, or that the world becomes so terrible that only a Messiah can fix it. And I don't want to find out what the second one looks like. But I do know that if we make a world worthy of Messiah, I think we might turn around and realize we were it. There just wasn't anyone coming, but we made a world, right? We are a sort of a corporate Messiah. And so I like the idea that we have a divine mandate to prepare a world worthy of a redeemer, knowing that there might not be a redeemer, and that redemption might only come through the process of making the world ready. And I want, in terms of politics, that means that I want to leave the world better than I found it, and I want to do the work actively in my life to make the world better. I mean, my wife is the founder and CEO, at least for now, of Detroit Youth for Justice, where we live in Detroit. Detroit's a hard place, and we live in Detroit, actually in the city, and we feel an obligation to work with Black and Indigenous folks here in the city to make this city a better city for everybody. And it's a great honor and a great mitzvah. It's a great act of tzedek, I think, to work with people on the ground to make your city and your world better. And I think that idea directly comes out of my Yiddishkeit.
That's beautiful. I think that's a wonderful place to end. Dr. Sledge, thank you so much for your time and for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for the great questions. It's great to go from like mysticism to the Gemara and everywhere in between. I really love these kind of podcast things. So thank you so much for having me on.